I have titled the sermon today, we're in Mark chapter 12, verses 13 to 17. I titled the sermon today, Give to America what is America's and to God what is God's. Okay? Another way of saying it would be, give to governing authorities what are governing authorities and to God what is God's. It just didn't seem to roll off the tongue in the same way. Okay? So give to America what is America's and give to God what is God's. On July 4th, every year we celebrate tremendous blessings that come from living in this country. Those blessings are many. When I look across the globe at the things that take place in other countries and I see how they limit freedoms and I see the different things that take place, it makes me very happy to live where I live today. I wouldn't want to live in any other country in the world. There is, however, a growing lack of understanding of the greatness of our country, thankfulness of our country, and the responsibilities that we have within our country. And this is the wonderful time of year for me to talk about those things, right? For me to discuss our role within our society, the role that the government has toward us, and the problems. Now here I believe to be the problem. Cotton Mather, long ago, Cotton Mather hit the nail on the head, and few of them know who he is, but he was probably the most influential of the pastors and of the intellectuals of his day. He was the most prominent among the New England states in the late 1680s, early 1700s. He was a pastor, historian, and leader of the American colonies. He even led a revolt in 1689 against the governor imposed on them by King James II. He introduced the smallpox inoculation in 1721. This is a guy who had a wide variety of skills and understanding, okay? He was a pastor, he was a theologian, he led a revolt against the king, putting a governor in place. He introduced the smallpox inoculation. Wide variety of things, correct? In his day, which was prior to the First Great Awakening, the colonies grew increasingly immoral, and there was a growing anti-Christian sentiment in the colonies. And it's hard for us to imagine that today, thinking back to that time period. But that is the way it is depicted over and over. And people believe, pastors believe, the First Great Awakening was necessary because of the growing godlessness in America, and that was to come a few years later. He was asked about these things within the colonies, and he said this: religion begat prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother. Religion begat prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother. What is he saying? The Christianity that we came over here with on the boats, it grew prosperity in the country, and what happened as prosperity grew? Prosperity itself devoured the mother that gave us all of these things. Religion begat prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother. Before the American Revolution and the battle for independence, the British people made a dangerous journey to America for a few reasons. One of them was religious freedom. Now, the people in the Virginia colonies, a lot of them were after something else. Do you know what it was? Money. So you can't say that the only reason that colonists came over here was for religious freedom, but it was a big part of it, especially in the New England states. Especially in the New England states. So then you have these people coming over here, and they made a compact. The first bit of law that was introduced in the states, in America, comes forth in the Mayflower Compact when they came over. These are the male passengers that arrived at Cape Cod in November of 1620. The Mayflower Compact, I've put it on here, it says, led by William Bradford, who was a very influential pastor in the Puritan New England area, in the name of God, amen, we whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Notice there why they're all together there on the boat. The Mayflower Compact's being made here. Why are they undertaking what they did? They're doing it for the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of king and country. A voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, due by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, so that is a civil government, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. Why are they getting together as a civil government? For the advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of the king and country. And by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and officers from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient, the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. Why did they undertake to do this? Why did they make the Mayflower Compact? For the advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of king and country. They covenanted together to build a community. And there were many hard times. There were many difficulties that took place through it all, but they understood that they were to be working for the advancement of the kingdom of Christ and the good of the civil government. You see both arms, we would say, of God's sword, as we'll discuss in the sermon today, represented there. They understood that it was their job to do both. There were many hard times. You've likely read about them in your history classes at some point. I hope you have. They even tried communal living. Which today we would call communism. They even tried communism. They gave it a shot and it nearly killed them all. They all almost died. Do you know how they came out of that mess? They gave people pieces of land, let them make money on their own farms, and they traded among each other. They even had given that a shot. There were many, many difficult, hard times in the early colonies. They changed course, and God blessed them with abundant harvest. The colonies grew in prosperity over the years. Cotton Mather is early enough in history that he can look at that. He's the son of Increase Mather, who was in Boston and preaching around 1660. He's close enough to when all of this took place, and he can hear about it from his dad, that when he sees the abundance that had taken place and how prosperity was growing and godlessness was growing in the colonies, he could say, this decrease in devotion to the Lord is because religion begat prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother. And it's a lesson we can see played out throughout all of the Western world. If I were to take a map of the world and lay over and write down on every country that has dominantly been Protestant Christian country in the past, what would I see? Every country that we list now as a first world country is a historically Protestant country. Why? Because Protestant Christianity has begotten some very prosperous people. That's why. You can look at a map at what used to be called the second world countries and see that those are the historically Catholic countries. You can look at a map at the third world countries, and what do you see is common among the third world countries? Christianity wasn't there historically. You see it played out before you in history. All you have to do is look at a map and you see that. But now we get to this point in time where Christianity is reviled. People believe that it's the dumb folks that believe it. But what has actually happened is what Cotton Mather said long ago, that religion begat prosperity and the daughter devoured the mother. It's led to numerous problems within our society. America and the rest of the Western world, as they shun this, they believe they're very intelligent. But what's actually happened here is Dad made millions and now the son is Billy Madison, for those of you who watch the movies. That's what's taking place. They believe themselves to be rather intelligent, but are really buffoons who think they got there on their own, right? Religion begat prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother. And we want to avoid this pitfall of ungratefulness, unthankfulness, of ingratitude. And we do that, I believe, by having a proper understanding of our relationship to the government's relationship to us, and how God stands over it all. How the Lord stands over it all. So when we see the boundaries that God has placed on governments, we begin to understand that there are things that a government can do and things that a government can't do. We look and we see how God designed for governments to interact with the people. We see that we are to live under authority to these governments as we live under authority to God. And as we do this, we understand that God stands over it all as ruler and king over all things. And we begin to have this gratefulness and thankfulness for all that has come down to us to this day. So what we're going to see in our sermon, our message today, God is Lord over all creation. Give to God what is God's, and to America what is America's. God is Lord over all creation. Give to God what is God's, and to America what is America's. Our text today in Mark chapter 12, verses 13 to 17. Jesus was approached by some people designed to trap him in questioning. It was a controversial question that they asked. The question that they asked here was one that people debated pretty constantly in this day. But they started with flattery. They started with flattery. What does the Bible say about flattery? Be wary of the person who flatters you. They're setting a net for a trap for your feet. I forgot to write it down, but my wife reminded me of that passage of Scripture. It's in the Proverbs. They set a trap for your feet. They set a net for your feet. What are they doing in this text? They flattered Jesus. Mark chapter 12, verses 13 to 17. Look at what they say here. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you're not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. What are they doing with this here? They're laying it on thick. They are, aren't they? We know that you're not beholden to anyone. We know that you teach God's word unfiltered. We know that you're out there doing this day after day. If someone were to come to me and say that, I'd say, oh, shucks. Right? That's better than, I would love it if someone were saying that about me and to me, right? I would enjoy that. They come to him with flattery. Flattery on their lips. They're laying a net for him, a trap for him in this moment. But they're used as bait to get him into the trap. And so here comes the question. Look at verse 14. At the end of verse 14. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? And the reason this was a big deal is because Rome had conquered Israel. And Israel was now forced to use Roman coin. They were now forced to use Roman coin. And to make matters worse, what did Roman coin have on it? A picture of a man who believed himself to be a god. So the people, because of the horrible sinfulness and detestable nature of Romans, had to debate whether or not it was right for them to use Roman coin. And there were more than a few people who were there saying, this is a godless thing to do, to use a coin with a person's face on it who believes themselves to be a deity. How would we feel about that? We might be saying the same thing. Put yourself in that situation. Jesus' answer here, when he gives it, we oftentimes look at it, we say they're setting a trap for him. Jesus avoided the trap. But Jesus doesn't just avoid the trap. He doesn't just avoid things here. He gives a clear explanation of the person's relationship to the state and the state's relationship to them in a very short and concise manner, so powerful that we should take heed to it when we're thinking through our relationship to the state. So most sermons I've heard have treated this text as if Jesus is avoiding the answer, that he's producing evasive maneuvers. But that's not at all what takes place here. Look at what he says. But knowing the hypocrisy, he said to them, why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. I have already mentioned in the children's message that a denarius was about a day's wage. A denarius is what someone would get for working a full day. And they brought one, and he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said to him, "Caesar's." Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they marveled at him. I don't believe they marveled at him. I don't believe they marveled at him because he had figured out a way to avoid their plot. I believe they marveled at him because he gave such a concise and strong answer to how they are to behave and how they are to live under the authority of the Roman government. And it's something that we take with us today. God is Lord over all creation. Give to God what is God's, and to America what is America's. Let's look at the beginning here. We read, the first point I'm going to take from this is God sets the boundaries. God sets the boundaries. Jesus is Lord over Caesar. If there's a foundational belief that we have about Christianity, is that Christ is Lord. He is King of Kings. He is Lord of Lords. We see this scattered throughout the whole of the Scriptures. Jesus is Lord over Caesar. When Paul says that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, that includes the president and that includes any king, right? We understand that's what King of Kings means. He is king over all kings. He is Lord over all lords. And so we understand that Caesar, in this case, and all of our governing authorities are not the ultimate authority. A governor does not get to decide how much power he has. That would be a dangerous thing. A president does not get to decide how much power they have. Again, that would be a dangerous thing. Kings are the same way. They don't get to decide how much power they have. One of the major controversies that came out of the 1500s was about a king's authority and a king's power. Samuel Rutherford wrote the book Lex Rex, which means the law over the king. And it's a huge book that depicts all throughout the kingdoms in the Christian era and all of the teaching from the Scriptures to say that kings do not have ultimate authority. They made oaths to the people when the crown was put upon their head. They are not above the law. They are supposed to keep the law. It's been a Christian teaching throughout the ages. David, when he was crowned king, had to pledge that he was going to do so under God's law, that he was going to keep God's law. We understand that this is how things are supposed to be. The king doesn't get to decide his own authority. God sets the boundaries. We look at Romans 13, verses 1 to 7. We read, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." So, what we notice at the beginning is that the governing authorities themselves have been instituted by God. They didn't come about on their own. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. What is the person in authority? God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. And you see in here that God is the one who instituted, who created these governments, who put the governors in place. He's the one who gave to them the power of the sword to bear out justice on the earth. And those governing authorities are to work for the good of the citizenry, to uphold the law, to be a terror to bad conduct, so that good citizens can dwell in safety in the land, right? What happens? What happens when criminals are not afraid of the governing authorities? Well, they throw stuff through the store window and take everything in the store, and shops have to leave town. We see this in the news fairly constantly, right? We see this in the news time and time again. What happens when governing authorities are not doing what they're supposed to be doing? What happens when they do not stay within the boundary that God has set for them? What happens when they decide they have to do something else instead? People run amok. Good citizens are scared. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's necessarily implies that there are things that there are Caesar's and things that are not Caesar's, and things that the rulers and the authorities are good at, things that they are not good at, things that God designed for them to do, and things that God did not design for them to do. The money had its face on it, and it was controversial. Rome had conquered Israel. It had now forced them to use their money, which had the picture of someone who believed themselves to be a deity upon it. But there were benefits to the Jewish people having Romans on their side, were there not? Their money was now worth more and could be used farther and wider than it had been in the past, because when a civilization is conquered as many places as Rome had, trade is going to increase, and any of these sorts of benefits you can think of are going to take place. There were benefits given to them as it paid for roads, military, police, among other things. So they were to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Caesar had a role to play. The Roman government had a role to play as long as they were in Israel. Governing authorities have their place is the lesson that we take from this. And God has instituted government for our good. But Caesar had no right to take more than was due him. When Caesar demanded to be worshipped and obeyed as if there was no authority above him, we'll see later that Christians said no. He had no right to take what was more than his due. And this idea is a lot of the reason that I am thankful to live in the USA. Our founders understood this concept better than a lot did, that we have rights, we have inalienable rights, pre-government or God-given rights that are ours. This just means that the government has no right to touch them, that they have no right to encroach upon these things. And in the preamble to the Bill of Rights, we read the conventions of a number of the states, having at the time of their adopting the Constitution, expressed the desire in order to prevent misconstruction of abuse of its powers that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added. What's the point there? The Bill of Rights is here being given. Why? To prevent the government from overreaching and taking away your rights. Why is the Bill of Rights there? There are things that the government is not supposed to touch. They understood that there was a lane to which the government was to stay. Whether they did it on purpose or accidentally, you can debate about it, but they got that right. It is extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of its institution. There were already checks within the Constitution. Some people didn't believe a Bill of Rights was even necessary because there were so many checks within the Constitution, but in the end they decided to put them in there. And there was a belief among them that governments tended toward overreaching and toward tyranny. And so they're really trying to keep government within its lane, and I believe there's something good and godly about that endeavor that took place at that time. And because of that, I'm incredibly thankful to live here in a country where that's understood. For comparison's sake, you can just look at Canada. There's a big difference in American rights and Canadian rights. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is what it's called, does not have the idea of unalienable rights. It doesn't have the idea of God-given rights in it. In Canada, the government giveth and the government taketh away, okay? They tell you what your rights are because they don't have within their constitution this understanding of pre-government, of someone existing over the government and granting rights to citizens. They don't have that like we have it here. And so during COVID lockdowns, when pastors would open up their church against governing authority in Canada, what took place? The government took away. And these pastors ended up going to jail. right? There's a massive difference between pre-government rights, God-given rights, toward a people who understand that government is to stay in its lane, and what we have here. We understand that there's a lane to which the government should be. And I believe it a good thing, a good godly thing that they found and that they put within our Constitution. There's a growing understanding that among the citizenry of our country that the government is to be involved in everything. And so government's hand reaches into everything, and it's not made for that. God did not design for governments to work into all of life's problems. And so you have a situation where there's an overreach into areas it was not designed for, and so it miserably fails in those areas. One example is college tuition. Government reaches its hand into college tuition, and what happens? Well, over the last 20 years, inflation has gone up 54%, but the cost of a college education went up over 200. What was going on? Well, you can see the whole process play out. Pell Grants, college loans are given in large sums of money, and as that's handed out in large sums of money, now colleges are competing for government money. Should the government have been involved in college education? It's not their lane. So when they start getting involved, they really mess things up. And as they mess things up, what do you see? They're handing out all of this money. It is an incentive now for colleges to attract more students because you're going to be getting vast sums of government money. Until today, what is it that colleges are trying to figure out what to do? Whether or not they should put lazy rivers on campus. LSU has one, and about a half a dozen other colleges in the country are putting lazy rivers on campus. Why? Because that's how you attract vast sums of government money to your campus. Government was not made to do that. God did not design government to work in that way, and it utterly fails when it does. When the government decided to get involved, it drove up costs in incredible ways. I would argue, along with others, that it also caused many of the problems that people complain about today with the single-parent households and divorce within households. The very help that the government that sought to give wasn't helpful in a long-term way and actually has done a good bit of damage. G.K. Chesterton saw this developed in the late 1800s, and here's what he said about it. Modern mothers and fathers of the emancipated sort could not do their quick change acts of bewildering divorce and scattered polygamy if they did not believe in a big benevolent grandmother who could ultimately take over 10 million children by very grandmotherly legislation. The only way you can get divorce after divorce, or have kid after kid, or one man have a dozen children by a dozen different women and not really care about it, is he believes the government will take care of it. That's the sort of thing, when the government comes in, it is not actually able to do. And I would also argue that we as parents understand that the education of our children is ultimately up to us. We know that when our child comes home from a public school, if our child is in public school, we may have to help them in areas their teacher didn't. But Puritan New England had a literacy rate of 80%. Puritan New England had a literacy rate of 80%. You're not going to find that literacy rate in a lot of school districts today. Arkansas spends over $10,000 per student per year. New York State spends $24,000 per student per year, and they cannot touch this 80% literacy rate that was going on in Puritan New England in the colonies when we first came over here. I do not believe government is actually able to dig in and do all the things that the government says and thinks that it can do. It has a lane through which it should stand, through which it should stay. By the way, Puritan New England had a kind of public education. It was just locally ran, right? So, the government, when it oversteps, it moves outside of the bounds that God designed for it. It is not capable of handling all of the things that people believe it to handle today. And I am incredibly thankful that God placed me here in the United States. I'm thankful for the good, the freedoms that we have in our society, the prosperity that has come. I believe government is part of God's plan, but government should stay in the lane and the boundaries that God has set for it. And we see here in his answer that Jesus himself said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's," and the answer astounded them. So, the second thing, give to America what is America's. Because God instituted government, we owe things to governing authorities. And here's the discussion about taxes. I've already said that using Roman coin was a benefit to the people, that having the ability to use these things and to get on and travel on the Roman roads to trade and all of the sorts of things that came with it, that was a help to the people of Israel. Some places within Israel gained prosperity as this took place because people from out of the country, what would have been considered out of the country before, were now traveling across and doing trade and all sorts of things within that city. And so there was prosperity gained in some sense there. There were a lot of gains that took place when this happened. I would not say that they wanted to be under Roman authority, but there were some benefits to being under Roman authority. There was that ongoing controversy about using Roman coin, and Jesus doesn't really dive into the discussion about him claiming to be deity. He only says that this coin belongs to Caesar, and so it has Caesar's image stamped upon it, and so it is his. Right? There are things that are Caesar's. There are things that are the government's. There are things that we owe to the government. Again, Romans 13 is important. We read that text already, so I'm not going to read it again. But we owe obedience to those authorities that God has put in place. We owe that to them, correct? God has put them in place as the sword of justice in this place. And so we understand that we owe them obedience, we owe them respect, we owe them honor, the honor that is due them. We owe to them taxes. No, I expected more of a groan. I heard one. We owe to them taxes. They cannot carry out their duty without money. They are ministers of God, he says in Romans 13. And because they are God's ministers to carry out justice, they have to have money to do that. We put it in today's terms. You can't have a police force without taxes, right? You can't have these things in place without taxes. And so we understand that there are some things that we have to pay taxes for. Now, we owe those things to the federal government and to the state government and to our local government. It's not all about money, but I will say that I do believe that our government does take too much. I mean, I read the waste report every year, Rand Paul's waste report, and it's kind of a just for fun kind of a thing, but it really kind of hurts. You know, we spend like billions of dollars to see the habits, to see if we can get pigeons hooked on gambling and to see how much they'll gamble. Like we figured out last year with something like $600,000 or $700,000, we handed some type of coin to pigeons so that they would put it in a slot machine and see if they would do something with it. I don't know if they did, but it made me laugh to think they did it. We'll figure out the mating habits of a rat on cocaine. Why? I don't know, but we do it. We'll spend millions of dollars on things like this. So I do believe they're getting too much money, but there are benefits that come with that, and there are things that they cannot do that they need to do, and they would not be able to do without money. And so we give our taxes and that sort of thing to them. We don't owe things to our local, our state, and federal government simply because they say we do. We owe it to them because they're instituted by God. They are the authorities here because God has placed them in authority. They're not ultimate authority. They are under the Lord. God has instituted them. Therefore, we owe them that. They are God's ministers of justice in the land. And it is true that our home is God's kingdom. It is true that we are strangers and sojourners in this land. All of this is true, but you have to put the ideas together. And Jeremiah 29, 5-7 does that well. God's instructions given to a people who lived in exile. They're going to go live in exile. What is it they're supposed to do? Jeremiah 29, 5-7, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. So, we're seeking the good of the place where we live, right? Seeking to expand, live life, buy homes, have children. That sort of thing are the things that we're supposed to do as people in exile. But we're also working for the good of this place. When you put the two ideas of us being sojourners and strangers in the land, God's kingdom expanding in the land, and us being citizens of America, you see that we're supposed to be people who are working for the good of the place where we live. And I count it as one of the great blessings in life that I get to live here and have the freedoms and prosperity that much of the rest of the world does not have. The last thing we see is give to God what is God's. When I heard this explained one day, it floored me. Jesus handed the coin. He handed over the coin. He shows them the coin, and he says, whose image is on this? And they said, Caesar's. And Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. What has God's image stamped upon it? What has God's image stamped upon it? You do. Right? I do. We were people created in the image of God. Let us make man in our own image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. The coin had Caesar's imprint upon it, had Caesar's image stamped upon it. What has God's image stamped upon it? Everyone. All of humanity. Everyone. What is implied here by Jesus? What is he saying? What do you owe to God? Right? Give to God what is God's. What is it that you owe to God? Everything. Right? Everything. And if you think about what we've said today, we've ultimately said the reason that we obey authorities in this world is because we are being obedient to God. An act of obedience to the Lord is being a good citizen here. So the entire thing is saying we have everything to owe to God. God created us. He made us. We owe God worship. He rules and he reigns over all things. He is the one sustaining the universe. And so we owe to God everything. And for the Christian, we understand this in an even deeper way. God saved us. That our entire race fell into rebellion. It had earned for itself God's wrath and God's justice. And God saves us out of that condemned mass of humanity through the perfect life, death, and resurrection. That God the Son took on human flesh and dwelled among us. He lived that perfect life on our behalf, and he died on the cross, and he paid the punishment for sin on our behalf so that we could be redeemed out of that condemned mass. We understand in greater and greater ways as we live our life that we owe everything to the Lord. God created us. He made us. He sustains us. He sustains the universe. He's made things work the way they are. And despite all of that, we were rebel sinners who hated God and hated his ways, and he saved us. And so we understand this in incredible ways. And this understanding helps to clear up all of the discussion about government's relationship to the Christian. And when should we disobey? When should we disobey? Well, we understand that there's an authority that stands over governing authorities. That is God. And when they tell us to disobey God's law or God's rule or God's ways, we say no. Christians were persecuted under this same Roman government for drawing a line between what was owed to Caesar and what was not. They drew that line, and so they were persecuted. They understood that there is a line. Increasingly, in our country, there is not an understanding that there is a line. There is a line that we should not cross, and we see that in the book of Daniel. We see that in the book of Acts as disciples of Jesus disobey the governing authorities to go and preach the word because they know that to obey the command of the government would be to disobey God. Daniel was told not to pray, and what did he do? He opened the windows and he prayed where everybody could see him praying. We understand that there is a line that we will not cross because God is the one who stands over all. Francis Schaeffer discussed early Christians in Rome when he said the early Christians died because they would not obey the state in a civil manner. People often say to us that the early church did not show any civil disobedience. They do not know church history. Why were the Christians in the Roman Empire thrown to the lions? From the Christians' viewpoint, it was a religious reason. But from the viewpoint of the Roman Senate, they were in civil disobedience. They were civil rebels. The Roman state did not care what anybody believed religiously. You could believe anything, or you could be an atheist. But you had to worship Caesar as a sign of your loyalty to the state. Did you get that? They had to say, Kaiser est Kyrios, which is Caesar is Lord. The Christians said they would not worship Caesar, anybody, or anything but the living God. Thus, to the Roman Empire, they were rebels, and it was civil disobedience. That is why they were thrown to the lions. You can read the ancient writings from Rome, from different people who were involved in all of this, and that's exactly right. They were civil rebels. They wouldn't call Caesar Lord. They would not worship Caesar. They would not do anything that was disobedient to the Lord and his commands. Rather than not worship the Lord on Sunday, what did they do? They worshiped in secret. They worshiped anyway. They tried to find people's homes on the outskirts of town so maybe they wouldn't get caught. They tried to find places in secret to worship so that they would not be thrown to the lions. But would they ever not worship the Lord? No. They were not going to do that. There is a line that we will not cross. We see that through the history of the church. We owe all worship and we owe all obedience to the Lord. It is to him that we owe our final and full obedience. The state has no right to tell us how to worship. The state has no right to tell us when we can worship. The state has a lot of things that they're good at, and they have a lot of things that they have no right to tell us, and this falls within that. And this has been the problem in a few of the states in our own country during the COVID scare, when places would open up a pot shop and say that people needed their medical marijuana, but they didn't need to go to church. What happened? A few churches in California went ahead and opened up their churches. And praise be to God, they filed a lawsuit against the state of California and won millions. Okay? No state in the country has the right to tell the church when it is allowed to worship, how it is supposed to worship, how it is supposed to carry out its business. The state has no right to tell us how to break God's law, has no right to tell us to ignore God's law. The state has no right to force you to give them children. We see this in places like Germany. It is illegal to have a private school or a homeschool in Germany. England is passing laws that are similar to that. They do not have that right. We teach our kids to respect the authorities of the state because the Lord commands it. And if there ever comes a time when local school districts are obviously attempting to mold our children in the image of the perfect secular person, then it is time to pull the child out of public school, right? And I believe that you do this district by district, because I believe it is very different to raise a child in Conway, Arkansas, than it is to raise a child in, I don't know, LA or somewhere in California or somewhere near. There's a vast difference between school districts. There are places in the country today that I would go and I would say that a person is in sin for having their child in public school. I would say that. But insofar as the government does what it is supposed to do, it is to be praised and it is to be supported. And the reason is clear, because God is Lord over every government in the world. Jesus reigns over every authority. He is King of Kings and he is Lord of Lords, and he has allotted the place where government is to be. I'm going to have a time of invitation. If anybody wants to come and to speak with me, if they want to come and discuss any of this, if they want to come, if they've heard the good news of what Christ has done on their behalf, I would love to talk with them. If they just have a prayer request or they just want to come and pray at the altar, I would love for that to be the case. I'm going to close today by saying, I read this week that pride in our country is at an all-time low. Things are pretty bad right now. I bought gas for our church's lawnmowers and almost choked on the receipt. But I do consider living in this country to be a great blessing. I have incredible freedoms and prosperity that I would not have had otherwise. And a lot of the reason for the incredible freedoms is because our founders did understand this role that government was to play. They understood that there was one that stands outside of government and that the government was not to dive into every portion of life. I believe we are blessed to live in this country. So, when we're finished today and tomorrow, it's good to go out and, as long as you don't lose a finger, shoot off fireworks, celebrate, do that sort of thing. But I believe that when we understand the role that government plays in our lives and how we are to relate to it, we become people who are grateful and thankful for all that we have, rather than the ingratitude that we see running rampant throughout society.